One, and welcome everybody to another special responding to Jordan Peterson conference pregame session with New Symbolization Project, aka NSP. I'm Dave or Lisa. I go by both because I have no idea what I'm doing with my life right now. And this is Ann.
I'm Ann. Hello.
President and Vice President. We've got a lot of other members in the club. Like there's thousands of us, but it's just the two of us today.
Yeah. Everyone else is just busy.
Yeah. But no, for real, like we tend to have more than this in the flesh, but it's cool that we have people joining us live from all over. And there's just a lot going on, and we've had a lot of events lately, and it's kind of stretching us thin. And so we're about to pull back and pretty much just focus on the conference. But yeah, this is the purpose of the pregame sessions is to build hype before the conference and to also give presenters who are not able to join us physically an opportunity to present with a bigger audience, really, because people who are really excited about the conference but who probably want to sit face-to-face with actual people who are really presenting and would be less likely to sit in on a Skype session are this way able to still engage with the people who will be there at the conference. And then, of course, at the conference, all of the sessions will be streamed live. So folks like Ben and Tanner will be able still to join to see anything, but also like this one, it's going to be available on our YouTube channel. It's not only live, it's also being recorded. So everything you say can and will be used against you everywhere in the court of culture. So that's it. All right, that's our spiel. I'll say a thing about NSP. New Symbolization Project is the critical theory club at Boise State University. This Responding to Jordan Peterson conference the subtitle is In Lieu of a Debate, because he had a debate scheduled with Douglas Lane of Zero Books for the Zero Squared podcast, and then he canceled that debate. Peterson did, like last minute, before going on the Joe Rogan show and saying that Marxists will not debate him or engage in dialogue, which obviously is not true. And then when challenged on this, he said, oh, well, Lane's just not popular enough, which is obviously not an excuse. But because Lane's not popular enough, we booked Richard Wolff to either debate Peterson or speak in lieu of a debate. And so Richard Wolff will be here and presenting on October 20th and in lieu of a debate, because Peterson said that he wouldn't do it for less than $50,000 when Wolff was willing to do it at cost. So yeah, we're going to have Zero Books present. Symptomatic Redness, the Michael Brooks Show. Michael Brooks is also on the Majority Report podcast, and then a bunch of academics and activists who will be coming from all over to respond to not Peterson as a human being, but to Peterson as a cultural phenomenon. And yeah, I think that the threefold purpose and meaning of what we're doing here is we're shattering the illusion that Peterson wants to engage in reasonable dialogue. We're shattering the illusion that the left is only hysterical and cannot engage in rigorous critical discourse. And we are using all of the hype to reach out to the intellectually curious of the public and his fan base to say, hey, you've been told a lie about the left, that this anti-PC industry machine that you have been receiving information from for so long and has such a monopoly on YouTube and elsewhere is essentially taking from the lowest hanging fruit of the left, cherry picking that into a straw man, and then acting as though that's everything that we are when we're not. So with that, we're just going to play, I don't know. Actually, I mean, I don't know. Ben, how do you feel about going first, just in case Tanner doesn't show up, you know?
Yeah, I'm very happy to go first. That's fine by me.
Cool. Yeah, and so, I could sit here and I could read off the description I have of you and all that, but I figured it would be a little better for you to just share a little bit about yourself and the situation that you clued us all into as for how, or I mean, why you won't be able to join in the flesh. You said among many reasons there was this thing with your partner, and so there's that, and then there's just kind of like what you do academically and where you're stationed at. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. So yeah, my name is Ben Whitham. I'm lecturer in international politics at the University of Leicester, De Montfort University in Leicester in the UK. My research and kind of what I teach really relates to security politics, and especially the war on terror. And within that, I became interested during my PhD really in representations of Muslims in political discourse and in media discourse. And the kind of current research that I'm engaged in, sponsored by the Centre for Urban Research on Austerity at De Montfort, is really looking at the people's lived experiences of Islamophobic or anti-Muslim abuse and discrimination in the UK, and how those experiences, how that abuse and discrimination intersects with kind of economic issues around austerity and kind of cuts to public spending and so on. The reason that I'm not going to the conference in person, as you say, it's partly about my partner, but also something wider. My partner is a British Pakistani. As a consequence, she has a Muslim name, you could say. Her surname is Ali. We've traveled to the US together once before to a conference. We're both academics. We went to a conference in San Francisco, an International Studies Association, big association conference, and on the way, she was profiled in the airport. She wasn't allowed to check in online. Our booking was a joint booking made by a university, but for some reason, well, I assume obvious reasons, I was able to check in online and she wasn't. She was then subject to like a series of extra security checks, both at Heathrow actually, and also in the US, where we made a connecting flight and then finally arrived in San Francisco. So we'd not had a great experience of traveling overseas before, and as somebody who is, let's say, maybe visibly Muslim and has a name that is seen as a Muslim name, she is often nervous about traveling internationally because it's the experience of herself and many others that she knows that they will be profiled, they will be pulled aside for extra security checks and so on. So in the context of Donald Trump and the executive orders banning in some cases all travel, all visa applications for people from majority Muslim countries. She feels particularly threatened by this and doesn't feel safe traveling to the US. In fact, she withdrew from the last ISA conference and wrote an article in the Times Higher Education here in the UK about her reasons for doing that, which were really about the Muslim ban, or so-called travel ban, that have been instituted. So basically, I don't really feel comfortable traveling to the US at the moment myself either, because I feel like I'd be exercising a privilege that my own partner doesn't have, let alone many other people. So yeah, that's my introduction. Do you want me to go straight into the paper? And
yeah, I guess I'll say one more thing for the good of the order, and that's just that I mute microphones from other people who are not the presenter, and I'll keep ourselves muted so that there's not feedback or interruptions while you're talking, but that everyone is always encouraged to interject when they feel like it. And so, hi Austin. I'll just repeat what I was just saying because it wasn't a lot. So Ben. Is it Witham or Witham?
Witham.
Witham. So Ben Whitham's about to present, and he just did his introduction. I was just making a note for the good of the order to say that everyone's going to be muted. Oh, poor Dougie's going to be muted too. Everyone's muted, and that's to cut down on feedback. But if you have a question or an interjection, you're highly encouraged to unmute yourself, say what you want, and then always just mute yourself when you're done. So that's all. We'll give it up to Dr. Ben Whitham. Thank you.
How long would you like me to talk for?
Oh, great question. So we assume that the talks will be 10 to 20 minutes. with a 10 to 15 minute Q&A. So yeah, that's pretty standard for conference presentation. If there's like lots of really good conversation, sometimes we'll let it go over or whatever. But yeah, that's the basic idea.
Okay, that's great. I'll try and keep it to 15 minutes. Okay, am I good to go?
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, thanks very much for having me virtually there. And I am sorry that I wasn't able to attend in person when the conference comes around in a few days' time. The idea behind the paper that I submitted, that I wrote in response to the call, stemmed from, I think, I've been interested in Jordan Peterson's use of terminology, as have many others. What seems to be kind of contradictory or confused use of terminology when he's describing the people he considers to be his political opponents. So terms like postmodern neo-Marxist, for example, also his uses of terms like cultural Marxism. I was kind of thinking about those, the way that he uses those terms, and the kind of paper that I've written really stems from my reflections on that. So my argument really is that I think we can use the concept of free speech to get to the heart of kind of where these quite contradictory sounding terms like postmodern neo-Marxist come from. Free speech has been at the very center, I think, of the recent rise of the far right in the US, certainly here in the UK, and actually throughout Western Europe, where we've seen far-right parties like the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany and the Front National in France also on the rise. The concept of free speech is mobilized almost continuously by a lot of these parties. It's also been used by Jordan Peterson to, both in his kind of public appearances and his writings and his social media as well, to kind of, I think, pinpoint what he considers to be his enemies, politically speaking. So the far right, including, I would argue, Jordan Peterson, seeks to try and situate itself as the guardian of free speech in the face of what it sees as a totalitarian political correctness. But the argument that I make in the paper is actually that it's not only the far right that's been kind of whipping up this cacophony of noise around free speech. And I mean, in the UK, we are still seeing stories every day using this term in big national daily newspapers. A good example would be in, for example, The Guardian, and also in The Times and The Telegraph. On a more or less every couple of weeks and more or less kind of fortnightly basis, we get stories about free speech on campus, the chilling effect of political correctness around free speech on campus. So what we find in the way that that debate is playing out, I argue, is that liberals are finding themselves in a very similar place, actually, to some of the far right, in that they too are defending this kind of concept of free speech. So they too are opposing no platforming policies on campus and so on, in the name of defending free speech. And this is based on a kind of principle that I think Dawn Foster, in a recent article for Huck magazine, really nails, where she says that political centrists are convinced that, and quote, a smart liberal with a propensity for misquoting Voltaire can destroy their, that is the far right's, worldview. So the kind of liberal response to the rise of the far right has been to say, well, let's debate them, let's argue with the far right publicly, and you know, their bad ideas will not win out in that kind of debate. So essentially that fascism will be cold product in the marketplace of ideas. And this is obviously a strong tradition in liberal thought, and even in neoliberal thought. Milton Friedman in Capitalism and Freedom makes a very explicit argument about the idea that what he calls the residual racism in the US was, in his view, a problem of the fact that there was too much socialism, essentially, and particularly that socialism had been particularly attractive to minorities, and that in fact, if there were more power handed over to markets, we would see a much more just and less racist order in the United States. Dawn Foster's article actually points to the idea that this kind of argument about providing a platform for an open debate, a marketplace of ideas, and in that context seeing the fascists lose, comes from debating societies at elite universities like Oxford and Cambridge in the UK and the Ivy League universities in the US. She points out that when Nick Griffin, the previous leader of the British National Party, the kind of main, what was the main fascist party seeking election in the UK and the inheritor of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, when Nick Griffin was leading that party, lots of university debating societies, the Oxford Union and so on, were chomping at the bit to kind of get him to come and debate, to come and take part in debates in those institutions, and they were doing this without really recognizing the fact that, thinking that they could, in her words, crush the BNP with a sharp argument, and ignoring the fact that Griffin himself had studied law at Cambridge. And indeed, Griffin, in the name of debate, in the name of the liberal argument for debate, was invited on a number of mainstream television programs. He spoke on Question Time, one of our main kind of news programs, late night news programs here in the UK, and various other things, and continued to act as leader of the BNP and draw more attention to the party. So I guess the argument I want to make at the beginning of the paper really is that debating fascists doesn't make them go away, and there's really no evidence that the kind of liberal argument that if we can just debate these ideas, then fascism will recede, is true. So it's problematic. That's an argument about free speech, I think, a liberal argument about free speech. And I want to kind of push it a bit further and say that it's not just that liberals are wrong to say that free speech is the key to defeating fascists, and that we must protect free speech in our struggle against the far right. It's that free speech itself is a universal abstraction. It's something which has never existed in practice, because the right to free speech is described by liberals as a universal right, something that should be a universal right, but it cannot be, and it never has been, in fact, in history. Now, in the second part of the paper, I kind of point to the fact free speech is certainly a very old concept. In Euripides' plays, the term, the ancient Greek term "poesia" is first used. There was an interesting book just published in English in the last few years of Michel Foucault's lectures at the Collège de France on this concept, called "The Courage of Truth," on this concept of poesia. But he takes it from its first usage, its first recorded usage at least, is in Euripides. It's often translated into free speech, although it might have a slightly more specific meaning, poesia. It's more about speaking truth, and in some instances speaking truth to power, but being honest and being open, rather than what I think we understand free speech to mean as today through the kind of liberal context. And yet, even in that ancient Greek context, where you first see this concept, which we now translate as free speech, poesia, emerging, it's very clear that it's not a universal right, that it's actually highly specific. It's a right that only belongs to a few. And I use a passage from Euripides' play The Phoenician Women in the paper to kind of illustrate this, in which a character, Jocasta, asks Polynices what his life is like as an exile, and Polynices responds that it's terrible, and when Jocasta asks in what particular way is it terrible and what's the kind of biggest problem as an exile, Polynices replies that the worst right is this: the worst is this: the right of free speech does not exist. And the word that free speech is the translation, but the word poesia is the word that's actually used in the original. Jocasta responds, that's a slave's life. be forbidden to speak one's mind. And I think that's a useful passage just for thinking about the fact that they're not talking about a slave's life in a metaphorical sense. There were literally, up to 80,000 slaves in Athens at that time. Slaves were not allowed to speak freely. So there have always been exceptions to free speech. It's never existed as a universal right. And the argument I make in the paper is that we still see today that, in fact, free speech is a concept that is invoked in order to protect a privileged right of certain sets of people to speak in ways that reinscribe the power and privilege that has accumulated to them. And that when people who are not supposed to speak freely do so, they are often hounded. And I give an example of we've recently had in the UK, a Cambridge academic, Priyamvada Gopal, who has written extensively on kind of colonialism and empire, get into a series of debates with another scholar who has an approach that we might call imperial amnesia, let's say. And that's resulted in her being hounded by the press, by the Daily Mail, but also by lots and lots of social media users. And she's been accused of being uncivilized in her discourse for calling this other scholar a racist, which he undoubtedly is. So because she's trying to speak, but speak from a position that is not one that has this kind of privilege accrued to it of being able to speak freely, her speech is shut down. I mean, other good examples of contemporary spaces in which we don't have unfettered or universal free speech would be, I mean, here in the UK, we have an awful lot of laws about what can be said and even read in relation to terrorism. So there are types of documents that are banned. There are specific publications that are banned. Inspire, the kind of Al-Qaeda magazine, was a proscribed publication. We've jailed people here for being in possession of digital copies of that. For that matter, the Anarchist Cookbook was made a proscribed publication here some time ago as well. People have been jailed for things they've written on Twitter in the UK. It's not the case that we've ever had a kind of universal form of free speech, but I would argue it's not the case in any society. So there's some kind of contradictory content to this liberal claim that we should still defend free speech even when we're engaging with fascists and the far right. So the argument that I go on to make in the paper, and this is really the central argument of the paper, I suppose, or the kind of turning point of the paper, is to say that what I think people like Jordan Peterson perceive, and the reason that he might use kind of seemingly contradictory terms like postmodern neo-Marxist, and I say that's contradictory just because debates between what we might call postmodernists or post-structuralists and Marxists have been really quite fierce across the social sciences and humanities, post-structuralists, postmodernists, whatever you want to call them. People like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida often explicitly articulated their projects in opposition to aspects of Marxism. And consequently, Marxists and some prominent examples of people who've written very clearly against postmodernism would be people like Alex Kalinikos or Frederick Jameson, for that matter. So there's been this kind of tension. So the idea that you would join these two things together in postmodern neo-Marxist maybe seems kind of contradictory. But I actually think that what Peterson perhaps rightly perceives is that the various kind of groups that he considers his enemies, groups of intellectuals, of activists, postmodernists, post-structuralists, neo-Marxists, feminists, trans rights, and queer theorists, these kinds of groups of people, they do share something in common. And I think that the thing that they share in common, and the reason that he perhaps is melding these things together in the way that he thinks about his kind of enemies, is that they all share an opposition to the kinds of universal abstraction that include things like a right to free speech. So the argument that I make in the kind of middle section of the paper is really that the kind of contradictory nature of some of the terminology that we come across is based in Peterson's writing, and particularly in his kind of social media persona, is based on the fact that he's kind of perceiving this this shared hostility from all these groups towards a worldview that he is very much attached to. Marx, was famously hostile to the whole concept of what he called so-called human rights, precisely for the kind of reason that they are abstract universal principles that treat the human being as an isolated monad. Same sort of argument he makes against liberal political economy in the Grundrisse, where he talks about the kind of the abstraction of people from social context into an imagined Robinson Crusoe-like isolated monad. So rights are not a useful basis for political emancipation as far as Marx and Engels are concerned, and that's very clear. Postmodernists or post-structuralists, whilst kind of being extremely critical of many of the concepts that are central to Marxism, concepts like ideology and so on, are also very much attached to the idea that actually when we study, theorize, and kind of act in the world as political agents, we should do so on the basis of actual political practices, how the world actually is, the world as we find it, not on the basis of universal abstractions. So people like Foucault, or for that matter, Pierre Bourdieu, focus very heavily on concepts like practice as the kind of what should be the object of our study if we want to theorize and understand the social world better. And feminists across a wide range of, both across multiple kind of waves of feminism and then across a range of different theorists coming from quite different positions, are often strongly attached to the idea that lived experience and social practice, concrete lived experience, should form the basis of our theorization, our understanding of society. Now, I finished that sort of section by talking about Judith Butler a little bit, and I know I'm just going out of time, so I'm going to kind of try and wrap up in the next couple of minutes. Peterson has some kind of singularly hostile views towards Judith Butler and what he calls her queer studies feminism. He's tweeted quite a bit about her. He's extremely hostile to her. Peterson's, I think what he's trying to get at is actually gender, the kind of concept of gender as it's used generally in academia today, rather than specifically Butler. Although I think he having probably not read any of the work, struggles to get to grips with it. But it's very clear that, again, gender theory is a set of theories that are rooted in concrete actual social practice, rather than in these kinds of universal abstractions. I mean, if there's one thing that Judith Butler has contributed to the theorization of gender through concepts like performativity, is the fact that gender is something that is emergent, that exists in practice in the form of spectrums, that doesn't exist in big, simple, universal binaries. So I've had to condense this quite a lot. I hope it's kind of sticking together reasonably well, but I'm just going to wrap up by talking for 1 minute about the kind of conclusions that I draw from this. So I argue at the end of the paper that there is not and cannot be a universal right to be publicly racist, misogynist, homophobic, transphobic, a right to free hate speech, if you like. And yet that's exactly what current far-right movements enabled by liberal, centrist, free speech supporters are seeking to establish. And I argue that Peterson can be perceived as a component of what I would say is a neo-fascist movement. Much like other figures ranging from Donald Trump to people in the UK like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, he's participating in a kind of symbolic network, a sort of hate signaling, if you like, to turn the virtue signaling accusations that people like Peterson like to use on its head. A sort of hate signaling that is all about instilling in people a feeling that the moment for fascist ideas and the moment for white supremacy has come at last. And towards the end of the paper, I won't go into it now, but I use some of the work of Italian fascist theorist Alfredo Rocco to describe how the kind of logics of fascism really function and why I think it's reasonable to see Peterson as attached to that. And the final concluding argument I make really is just that liberalism is fundamentally inadequate to guard against this insurgent neo-fascist tendency in which people like Peterson are enmeshed. Liberals find themselves co-opted by fascists on exactly this issue of free speech. And this is emblematic of kind of deep contradictions in liberalism. A rights-based politics, I say, will fail in the face of authoritarianism and hate because rights are precisely universal abstractions and they do not and cannot exist universally in practice. I'll leave it there because I think I've gone a few minutes over, so thanks for bearing with me. I hope that made some sense. It's 2 o'clock in the morning here, so I'm slightly exhausted.
Well, yeah, no, you did fantastic, I think, and it all made a lot of sense, so thank you. Also, those going over a couple of minutes gave, it looks like, just enough time for Tanner to be able to join. Tanner, I put you on, I muted your microphone in case you can hear us right now. I think you probably can, but we can't hear you. But here, I can't unmute you either. All I can do is mute people. I can't unmute. You can unmute yourself, though. If you push that button, you'll be able to talk. I see you talking, but we still can't hear you. You'll have to find the microphone button on your phone. And while you try to find that, I'm going to say another thing. Ben Whitham, let's go ahead. It looks like Tanner's trying to find a place to do this presentation. I'm assuming he's like in transit, unless of course he wanted to do a walking, talking presentation, which of course would, you know, harken back to the good old times of the walking school of Athens, you know, but which is, I think, a probably pretty cool concept for a conference, maybe next time. But yeah, let's do a Q&A session for Ben. I think it makes more sense to do it now instead of later, seeing as Tanner is just now joining us. Let's just do this part now. So let's open it up for questions. Let me clarify. First, you'll have to unmute yourself if you do want to say something. And then 2, not just questions, criticisms, comments, whatever you find inspiring, interesting, new, or potentially problematic, or something you want to challenge. Everyone's welcome to do something.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi. Ben, really enjoyed the talk. I was curious, and I know this didn't seem to be exactly your focus, right? You're more concerned on the nature of speech within liberalism and the question of this resurgent sort of alt-right, not just ideology, but performance within the public space. But my question was more about the public space itself. You know, when we're looking at the comparison of what we could tentatively call free speech in ancient Athens versus today, you're looking at a very different public sphere, not just in terms of things like media, but also the shrinking of that public space itself and the widening of it in breadth, certainly not at depth at the same time. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, on the nature of, you know, speaking to an audience versus speaking to a tree, and how that fits now versus then.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Should I respond now? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question. One of the kind of examples that I look at in the paper of a public space in which this politics has played out a little bit is The Economist magazine, hosted recently. I don't know if you saw it, but they hosted an event that was billed as being a kind of festival of ideas, and they invited Steve Bannon to speak at the festival. And I think actually beyond just Steve Bannon's presence there, these kinds of events are a very good example of the degraded nature of the public sphere we have when it comes to political debate. We have another event in the UK, takes place every year, called the Battle of Ideas, which happens at the Barbican in London, and is organized by actually one of the kind of main people who organizes it is a former communist, but turned very conservative journalist and publisher. The kinds of debates that take place in these spaces are almost exclusively, in my experience, debates between liberal and conservative middle-aged white men. And I think that the kind of parallel, because you're right, of course, that there's dramatic differences between the context of ancient Athens and the context of today. But the parallel that I wanted to kind of draw out from that comparison, or from raising that issue around the roots of this idea of free speech and its kind of limitation, I think goes a bit beyond just metaphor again, and is to point to the fact that these exclusions, which were kind of always partly racialized exclusions of who gets to speak and who gets to participate in the public sphere and which ideas are considered valid, that has continued, and it continues through not only hundreds of years later, centuries and centuries later, through European colonialism and the European kind of an American slave trade, but then in the kind of post-colonial context as well, because what we have now is an informalized system of, or deformalized, I don't know what the right kind of term is, system of exclusions based on racialized characteristics, racialized categories. And actually the language around that's been used in the kind of public sphere in the UK where these debates have been playing out, as I point out in the paper, the terms that come up, things like civility in relation particularly to when people of color, women of color like Priya Gopal is debating a white man. There was actually an even perhaps more pertinent example on the television in the UK, I think this morning, although it's kind of Wednesday here now, so maybe yesterday morning, Piers Morgan, who I think you might be familiar with as well, he's been on TV in the US, right? Had Kehinde Andrews on his show, and Kehinde Andrews was talking about Winston Churchill's racism, and Piers Morgan shouted him down with the question, well, if you hate Britain so much, why don't you just leave? To somebody who's lived their whole life in the UK. And this kind of, there are these very specific responses that people of color seem to get when they raise points that, were it to be a middle-aged white man making this point, they certainly wouldn't be asked why they don't just leave. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a continuity between the public sphere in ancient Athens and in the West today, and that continuity is around some of these kind of structured exclusions from who gets to speak. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Also, there's a lot of difference there, and I've not really thought too much about that. But that's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Then I think Elle had something. Elle, are you able to?
Yeah, I think I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, solid. Great presentation, Ben. I've just got one thing that I would ask for a point of clarification. So I just want to mention is for hate speech, because I think one of the problems we come up facing, especially here in America, where like free speech is codified, that like hate speech provisions with the conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism can a lot of times end up being used against liberation movements for colonized and oppressed peoples. So how would you have a working definition of hate speech that could not, in a certain sense, be used against progressive causes? Because again, too, there's another example, I don't know because you're based in the UK, but recently the Louisiana state legislature, I think successfully, or it might have been struck down, they tried to pass a bill classifying police officers as a protected group of people under the hate crime statute, so they could tack on a longer sentencing onto people convicted of crimes against the police or interfering with the police, so on and so forth. So I was just, in that context, I was wondering like what your working definition is for hate speech and how you can have a working definition that would not, in a certain sense, be used against progressive causes. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess I don't, for the purposes of the paper, I certainly didn't have a definition of hate speech. In the research that I'm doing at the moment on anti-Muslim racism, we've kind of defined what we see as Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, and that partly includes, what's said. So any forms of discrimination or abuse that are around the perception of the kind of recipient of that abuse or discrimination as a Muslim, which is not always the case. That's a really interesting question, and one that I need to think about a bit more, I think, because I talked about hate signaling, this kind of idea that came to me as I was writing the paper, I suppose. It's kind of different from hate speech, because very often it's about what we might call dog whistle kind of approach. It's not about using hate speech directly. So what people like Peterson say, for example, will be certainly, I mean, in the UK, we have relatively, I think, relative to the US, quite strict laws on hate speech. So, I mentioned earlier that people have been jailed here for things they've written on Twitter in the past. An example of that would be a few years ago, an undergraduate student at Swansea University was jailed for 6 months for writing racist tweets after a Tottenham footballer collapsed on pitch, had a heart attack. So yeah, we have quite stringent kind of laws around what constitutes hate speech already in place, but they wouldn't capture this kind of hate signaling, I guess, that I was talking about. So yeah, I don't really have like a working definition of hate speech in there. I think it's probably a concept I would need to account for if I develop the paper a little bit further, because to talk about universal abstractions and rights, well, hate speech as a concept, and I think it's a useful concept, and one that's obviously been of tremendous practical use in a variety of different contexts and societies, actually, but it is rooted in that kind of rights tradition. So that would be an interesting thing for me to look at. I'd like to look at it more. You gave a kind of example of the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and kind of how this can be used to shut down radical organizations that are maybe critical of Israel and so on. I mean, in the UK at the moment, I don't know if you've noticed, but this guy is having a very bad time as a consequence of the fact that he is continuously being attacked as an anti-Semite, or as somebody who at least tolerates anti-Semitism within the Labour Party under his leadership. The only grounds for all of these attacks, as far as I can see, for the most part, at least, the vast majority of the criticism is the fact that he has consistently criticized Israeli policy towards Palestinians historically, and he's attended various kind of Palestinian solidarity events. So yeah, the use of kind of the instrumentalization, I guess, of claims of hate speech and of racism is a big issue right now in politics here. But I don't think I certainly don't have an answer to how to address that, and neither does anyone else really. This is why the right wing of the Labour Party here and also the broader conservative right, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, the rest of the kind of mainstream of politics really is really still plugging away with the anti-Semitism line, because I think they have a strong feeling it could be the kind of final nail in the coffin for Corbyn, that it might be the Achilles heel and the kind of the thing that if they just keep plugging away and can convince everyone of the one thing that people would think was impossible, that this kind of kindly old anti-racist activist who has unexpectedly come to be leader of the Labour Party is in fact a vile racist, then that will be the end of his project. So yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I don't think I have a very good answer for it at the moment. Thanks.
I would like at least one more person to go before I ask my thing, but before I ask that person to go, just wanted to double check with Tanner. Tanner, have you found yourself situated? We can neither hear nor see you. Okay, well, oh. Now we get, oh, no, we saw you for a second, but we still couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, my technical literacy is obviously not up to par this evening, so I apologize for my lateness.
No worries. So are you going to give us a car presentation? Are you going to be driving during your...
No, I'm not going to be driving. I'll be walking.
Okay. Oh, you will be though?
No, I'm situated. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that's right. We're playing your video anyway. So I guess it doesn't even matter. So, but glad to have you here with us. Yeah. Let's take one more question. So Tanner, I don't know. Go ahead and try to mute yourself. Just
all right. Am I muted?
No. A little... You might be able, I think it's like you tap the screen and then it all appears and then you, there you go. You got it. You got it. All right. And yeah, so one more person have a question, comment, criticism for Ben Whitham.
This is just a shot in the dark. But do you think that there could be a way of sort of an imminent critique of the sort of right-wing push for free speech? Perhaps not an imminent critique, but a way of abusing the desire for free speech in such a way that it undermines the position that they provide, right? So what I'm thinking about is when these groups, these right-wing groups and centrist sort of liberal types defend free speech, what they're really defending is not free speech as a whole. They're defending free speech for a particular group of people that we could talk about in terms of like traditional speech. They want certain people to have free speech at certain times in certain places, and really what they want. So I'm in my context. I go to school in Ontario, and there was recently a bill passed suggesting that schools need to put forward a free speech sort of position in their school, and the intent in this is to allow A, conservative speakers on campus, and B, to quash any protests of those speakers. But I'm wondering if there's a way to just push back at the free speech by putting more and more and more people who traditionally don't have free speech rights and like affirming their free speech in a way, going so far into the free speech thing that you circumvent the position of those who are trying to use it to gain a position of power. So like overrun the conservative position with women of color, with trans people, just like push more and more. People who are in marginalized positions, keep giving them more and more of a voice in order to somehow drone out that traditional speech that they want to so badly protect. I don't know what that might look like, but there might be a way to affirm free speech in such a way that it undermines this traditionalist sort of approach to free speech. And it doesn't turn back into like this reactionary defense of repressing certain forms of speech, which I think is the danger of things like hate speech laws.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really interesting question too. I think the limits of what can be achieved through the concept of free speech are what I'm getting at in the paper, and I think that you might be right that we can change public discourse. And in fact, I think that, I mean, my view would be that the whole kind of one of the causes, at least, of the rise of the far right at the moment, I think there are multiple causes, not least the financial crisis, the economic crisis, you know, and we kind of, as people like Stuart Hall and Doreen Massey were saying at the time, you know, they were surprised there was no political crisis or ideological crisis that came along with that economic crisis. In fact, we basically returned to economic business as usual quite quickly because there wasn't a political crisis. And so arguably the kind of rise of the far right now and the recession of liberalism in the form of Trump, but also Brexit and things like that would be good examples of that kind of political or ideological crisis coming along. But I think the other, for me, cause of the rise of the far right now, particularly in terms of cultural politics and symbolization, would be the fact that we have had a tremendous proliferation of dissenting voices across a variety of media, including mainstream media, so not just through social media, although clearly social media platforms have been a place where these things have where radical movements and dissenting voices have been very clearly heard, but it's also spread to kind of mainstream media as well. So I think in terms of kind of a struggle to drown out the noise of the far right, if you like, there is that struggle is well underway and was already underway, you know, kind of prior to Jordan Peterson really becoming a thing. I would kind of argue that a lot of the far right activity we're seeing at the moment, up to and including Peterson, but also going to kind of more extreme far right, is a reactionary movement against precisely the ascendance of a new wave of feminism, really, arguably a fourth wave of feminism that was enabled by social media, enabled by things like Twitter and you know, accounts like Everyday Sexism and so on, but also the voices of kind of people of color trying to force the political and media establishments of Western states to recognize colonial histories that they've been able to completely ignore or suppress in various ways. So I think, yeah, basically I think the concept, I'm doubtful as to whether the concept of free speech can be a useful way of achieving this, because I think where you look at that concept, it's always attached to power and to the powerful. It's when you do see, for example, let's say just left-wing or for that matter feminist or anti-racist voices trying to engage in the same kinds of debates through social media platforms or on campus, they are often condemned as being kind of intolerant and aggressive, and you know, so that they are, you know, we're told that that's not part of free speech because it's uncivil, it's not polite, and so on. So yeah, I'm dubious about that. I absolutely understand and sympathise with your concern about the alternative to a principle that people can speak without fear of kind of punishment. But I don't think that the concept of free speech is maybe the right way to, well, yeah, I don't know if it's got the capacity to handle that. But yeah, I definitely think that the drowning out of the far right must take place. But I think it has been taking place in some ways. Yeah, don't know if that answers your question.
So I have sort of a follow-up. I think that our discussions around free speech tend to focus upon like a Habermasian framework of civil discourse, which can reach some sort of consensus. And I'm wondering if a reformulating of free speech in sort of a Muffian agonistic public sphere would be a good move to make in repositioning the discussion around free speech, because it's always assumed that if we, like the Habermasian model assumes that if we have conversations, we'll be able to reach a solution together, we'll be able to have some sort of consensual understanding, whereas an agonistic public sphere understands that there's always going to be contradictions in viewpoint, and it's impossible to ever reach some sort of consensus. But I wonder if the strength of repositioning the public sphere in terms of an agonism allows for the production of difference that isn't condemned in the way that it is condemned by people like Peterson, who suggests that anything different than his position doesn't fall into free speech because it is trying to dismantle with Western civilization or something like that. I don't know how we would promote this, because like your critique seems to be that the right's always going to reframe the debate in ways that undermine any principle that we're trying to pursue. They're always going to undermine the feminist position. They're always going to try to undermine these positions, and that I think shows the inconsistency of their free speech framing. But I'm wondering if we could reframe the conversation in a way that is beneficial through agonism rather than Habermasian consensus.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really valuable and interesting idea. It's not something that I thought about writing this paper, and I definitely will as I kind of develop it. I think yeah, my let's say pessimism would be around precisely as you say, it's like how do you achieve this? And so ideas around radical democracy from people like Lapal Mouffe or and the kind of acceptance of an agonistic public sphere and of a degree of kind of irreconcilability between political positions, which also, I guess, in the work of people like Rancière and the concept of dissensus, you know, is there too. These ideas, I think, are really useful, and they would be, it seems, better principles, I absolutely agree, upon which to organize our public sphere. The pessimism that I have is that they are they're a harder sell because they're more complex than the stories that we receive from the far right, and for that matter from liberals. Liberals have a nice simple story which is a story of kind of, it's a political aesthetic, a symmetrical political aesthetic, where there's a left wing and a right wing, and then there's the liberals in the middle, and the other two are just these sets of kind of extremists and cranks, and you know, the liberals will always find the one true way by being neutral politically, The far right has an even simpler story in a sense, which is just there's these minorities of sinister people, and everything bad that happens is their fault. So whether that minority is leftists or immigrants or gay people or whatever it is that they've chosen to pick on that day, but to convince people that the principle underlying our kind of public sphere should be one where we have to accept complexity and potentially irreconcilability of different ideas and so on is, yeah, it's a harder thing to practically envisage. And that's, I've always found La Femme Move, I'm very interested in their work, but I think a lot of people who are really interested in their work also struggle to see how do you make it, how do you make that politics in the real world. But so yeah, that's a really, really interesting question again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. I think we're just about there. Tanner, in just a second, we'll be asking you to make some brief introductions before we cue the video here and get that playing. I was just gonna make a comment. It's not so much a question, I guess, but it's just that I've been thinking a lot about this free speech thing because I've been on this research team that was it was part of my graduate assistantship work to like research civility or whatever, and I've just seen civility used to silence people a lot, and that when people say like let's just have a real conversation about it, those are the people who never really seem to want to have a real conversation about things. They never want to roll up their sleeves and get down into the nitty-gritty. And that as an adjunct instructor here, I've really like found, and especially like since coming out as like genderqueer, I've found myself, I've just realized that there's no such thing as free speech under capitalism, is how I'll put it. There is no free speech under capitalism because we need to work. And so if the free speech absolutists, people who just can't bear to think that there would be any sort of regulation of free speech, really want to have an absolutely free speech sort of ideal, like the only way to achieve that would be in a society where you can say something and then the repercussions of, say, being fired or excluded from a public sphere by people won't mean that you're homeless. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. There's a I mean, no free speech under capitalism is a good way of putting it there. And precisely the workplaces kind of increasingly become where this politics plays out. There was a case, I don't know if it was how much it was covered in the US. It was an American who lost her job after sharing a Guardian article written by a British journalist about white tears. And she shared it on Facebook, and her colleagues, her white female colleagues, saw that she shared an article that was precisely about when a kind of woman of color who's a feminist talks about their experiences in a way that upsets white women because let's say it's uncivil, it's incivil in that context, right? They're angry, for example, and the white women cry in a way that basically guilts the woman of color. So should this article have been written and then a woman of color shared the article and her white female colleagues reported it to their management, and she was sacked on the grounds that it was like hate speech, basically, and she was sharing this article which was hate speech towards white people. So the author of the Guardian article was Ruby Hamad, but I can't remember the name of the person who lost their job. But yeah, she was based in the US, whereas Ruby is based here in the UK. But yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly true. There can be no free speech because there are certain things that can't be said because they would undermine how we do things.
I think that there is free speech to some extent, but the speech is always constrained or limited by the context of the speaker and the relations of power that shape that speaker in relationship to the audience. So, one could, for example, while working a shift at McDonald's, say, I'm really, really bloody tired of sort of sitting around this grease fryer, and serving burgers and assembling burgers and smiling to the customer, but they'd soon be fired. So it's not so much that sort of speech is sort of legally constrained in that context, but that there are major deterrents, imposed upon the worker by the employer that will limit their sort of agency to express how they actually feel in all of its alienation in such conditions.
Totally. And in my case, it's more about like the people on my committee and the people who I do graduate research work for and under, or the people who I'm a teacher assistant for. In all of these cases, people who, if I've ever tried to be like, hey, this thing, and try to like say like in a respectful way, like to say that there might be an issue with something, the way that the way they react is though they've never been really challenged on such things. They just shut it down. Like there's just no. Yeah. Then the next day they're talking about how important it is that we have serious conversations and be civil and all this. And it's like, yeah, but whenever we try, okay, it's because all these people are courting your favor because of the need of you writing their reference letters or whatever. So,
that's really, really interesting. I mean, looking at those relationships within higher education, within universities, relationships between supervisors and students, relationships between university administrations and then professors as well. And then finally, relationships between university administrations, professors, and often companies that are sort of, expending, money on co-research projects. So there are some instances whereby scientists are not allowed, they're sort of constrained by a gag order to release information that would be of benefit to the public good if it in some way compromised the property rights or the integrity of the company that's co-financing their research. So there's all of these difficulties in higher education today, especially. Some way compromised the property rights or the... Am I still there?
Yeah, you're still there.
Okay,
so
there's some latency.
Let's just turn it over to you though to do self-introduction before we start the video. Say a little bit about where you're from, what the work is that you do, and this thing, and then we'll start it. So.
Sure. Thanks so much, and my apologies again for being late to this. I caught the last 20 minutes of the excellent presentation prior to mine, and the discussion was really, really insightful. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'm a professor of communication and media studies. I also participate in a number of social justice and left socialist organizations in Toronto. And the video that I've prepared for today is basically an overview of the alt-right's uses of this conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism, which is very, very popular on the far right today in the United States and Canada, and arguably internationally as well. So this is basically a presentation that just looks at the rise of that discourse, looks at the political uses, the ways in which the alt-right weaponizes this discourse of cultural Marxism. And then I look at how this plays out in some context as related to Jordan Peterson, and try to sort of make sense of his slippery usage of the term and some of its consequences. I don't argue that I don't believe Jordan Peterson is a fascist in the way that we would describe, say, Richard Spencer, Andrew Anglin, or one of the explicit neo-Nazi parties as fascist whatsoever. But I do concede that there is a kind of dangerous dog whistle politics that is employed. I'm not sure if Peterson's entirely cognizant of where this conspiracy comes from, or how the alt-right, or the American right, especially since the 1980s, has been using this or mobilizing this discourse. So it's whether by choice or ignorance, he still has deployed it in very problematic ways. And so I try to give the deeper historical and political context for the conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism. So it's about a 26-minute video lecture. And I hope it's interesting to your audience. And I welcome your criticism. I might be saying some things that are not to the liking of the audience, especially when in the conclusion I basically say, well, what would a self-help book for the socialist left look like? Can we write a 12 rules for life for the left today? And what would that sort of be constituted by, and so on? So anyhow.
Yeah, we've actually been working on our own like NSP 12 rules. And the first rule is instead of treat yourself like you're someone you're responsible for, it's treat yourself like you're an ice cold motherfucker. As ContraPoints or Natalie Wynn says in her YouTube video on the left, which if you haven't seen, you need to see because there will be no left unity unless it's through ContraPoints. Okay, that's just my plug. But all right. So
Excellent.
All right.
Well done.
Yeah, we're gonna start this thing now. So I'm gonna put on my screen share. That's the first step.
Yeah. And might I also say, you know, I welcome sort of radical critique of the narrative and of the assessment that I present here. This is kind of like a first iteration. I've been doing some work on this for a few years, and I've recently returned to it. So I welcome this sort of critical feedback wholeheartedly.
Cool. Well, this is neat. All right. Now, does everyone see this all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and it begins. Well, actually, and Tanner, can you mute yourself? Everyone will mute themselves.
Okay.
I guess we can't on this side. So, all right, there we go.
My name is Tanner Mirrlees, and since 2011, I've spent a lot of time reading and analyzing the hateful online discourse of the alt-right. I've read its articles, probed its memes and videos, and scrutinized its social media images and messages, especially those it creates about cultural Marxism. My presentation tonight is called Contextualizing Dr. Jordan Peterson's Cultural Marxism, a blue pill for the alt-right. In this presentation, I explore the history and politics of the alt-right's cultural Marxist conspiracy theory, to contextualize Peterson's slippery usage of the phrases neo-Marxism, postmodern Marxism, and sometimes cultural Marxism. When Peterson uses these terms as rhetorical weapons to attack left movements, policies, and practices related to political correctness and social justice, he, by error or by choice, peddles a blue pill to his followers. This pill has the effect of dulling their intellectual capacity for rational thought and obstructing their pursuit of knowledge about the real world. At the Historical Materialism Conference held at York University in Toronto, I presented a paper on the topic of the far right's conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism. My presentation was met with a lot of good humor from my peers who, having lived through decades of the neoliberal restructuring of society and the near total decomposition of the organized socialist left, thought it hilarious, if not absurd, that people could actually believe a Marxist left was society's ruling class. Thinking that the far right's online chatter about cultural Marxism was politically irrelevant and, well, pretty moronic, I moved on to other research projects. Fast forward to November 2016, and I started noticing an uptick in right-wing talk about cultural Marxism. And while this had once come from the extremist fringe of the movement, it seemed to now be coming from the mainstream as well. It was flowing across Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and all kinds of social media platforms. And this American right-wing conspiracy theory has evidently gone global and been locally adapted in a whole range of creative and confusing ways by right-wing intellectuals elsewhere, like here in Canada. The power of the alt-right's cultural Marxist conspiracy theory became apparent to me when Canadians started gabbing about it as well. Not just ordinary working-class Canadians, but professors too. Indeed, Jordan Peterson started retweeting stories like cultural Marxism is destroying America from alt-right websites such as the Daily Caller. And since then, Jordan Peterson has been represented as a local Canadian shill for this globalizing American conspiracy theory. In about 15 minutes or so from now, I will assess Peterson's slippery usage of the term cultural Marxism. But before getting to that, I want to take some time to unpack the right-wing history, meaning, and political uses of cultural Marxism. As a trigger warning, please know that I'll be displaying a lot of hateful images and clips from alt-right news sites, videos, and social media pages in order to demonstrate how noxious and irrational this alt-right conspiracy theory has become. So what is the history of the alt-right's conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism? Well, in Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels used the term cultural Bolshevism as an anti-Semitic epithet and as a cudgel for attacking their opponents, including jazz musicians. One might assume that the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91 and the triumph of neoliberal capitalism would subdue far-right anxieties about the specter of communism materializing in America, but this was not the case. Throughout the 90s, paleo-conservative organizations and far-right groups such as Paul Weirich's Free Congress Foundation seem to have resurrected the Nazi idea of cultural Bolshevism, but they renamed it cultural Marxism. Key texts in this genre include Michael Mendicino's The Frankfurt School on Political Correctness. William Lynn's Political Correctness, A Short History of an Ideology, is perhaps the most significant work. And William Lynn seems to have made friends in high places. Here's a 2016 picture of Lynn meeting a smiling Donald Trump. So, how does the American right-wing extremist movement explain the rise of cultural Marxism in America historically? Well, most of the time, they attribute this cultural Marxism to Antonio Gramsci, who, in the prison notebooks, developed a plan to win the working class consensually to the socialist project. But the alt-right then goes on to say it was only after Frankfurt School Marxist Jewish intellectuals Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, fleeing Nazi Germany in 1934, came to America and brought with them this cultural Marxism. According to the alt-right, the Frankfurt School and its disciples, such as Herbert Marcuse, influenced generations of Americans, creating the New Left and single-handedly causing the social movements surrounding feminism, LGBTQ rights, Black Power, anti-colonial liberation, environmentalism, pacifism, and many more to emerge in the 1960s. Then, throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, cultural Marxists had become a ruling class of sorts, exercising hegemony in civil society and finally taking control of the US federal government, the public education system, and the media and cultural industries. Once in power, this cultural Marxist elite sided with virtuous non-white people and minority groups and started attacking and undermining white cisgender conservative Christian men with doctrines of political correctness and social justice and multiculturalism. The story the alt-right tells about cultural Marxism in the United States is ludicrous. Nonetheless, this story has made a mark on the public mind. Since the turn of the millennium, derivative retellings and creative adaptations of this conspiracy tale circulate far and wide. There's even a feature documentary called Cultural Marxism, The Corruption of America, featuring figures such as Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul. But attacking political correctness and social justice is nothing new on the far right. Back in 2003, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which monitors American hate groups like the KKK, the neo-Nazi movement, racist skinheads, and Christian identity adherents, noted that the cultural Marxist conspiracy was catching on. The far right agitated against cultural Marxism during George W. Bush's two-term presidency. Then Tea Party activists claimed that the election of Barack Obama represented a coup for cultural Marxism, while birthers framed Obama as a foreign-born Muslim who was building a Marxist dictatorship. Right-wing shock jocks and Fox News pundits like Glenn Beck echoed this cultural Marxist conspiracy theory, as did alt-right infotainment sites like Breitbart News. In righteous indignation, excuse me while I save the world, Breitbart founder Andrew Breitbart described his discovery of cultural Marxism as a red pill. Breitbart News itself published numerous stories about so-called cultural Marxism and cultural Marxist elites, with stories with titles like Political Correctness equals Cultural Marxism, and Cultural Marxism is the enemy, and even little girls can be cultural Marxists too. A Google Trends data visualization of American search interest in cultural Marxism from November 2008 to November 2016 shows interest in cultural Marxism increasing. It trends upwards during the 2016 election campaign and spikes in the aftermath of Trump's win. Appropriately, Steve Bannon, Trump's chief strategist at the time, portrayed conservatives as under siege by cultural Marxism. Here he says, cultural Marxism is as real and dangerous now as it ever was in the Cold War, probably more so. This conspiracy theory seems to have even made its way up to the heights of state power. In the first year of Trump's presidency, Rich Higgins, the U.S. National Security Council's former director for strategic planning, bemoaned a cultural Marxist plot to turn public opinion against Trump. In a memo entitled POTUS and Political Warfare, Higgins explained Trump's unpopularity as the effect of, quote, withering information campaigns that serve as the non-violent line of effort of a wider movement to execute political warfare agendas that reflect cultural Marxist outcomes. And some Trump supporters see their man in the White House as making America great again by getting rid of cultural Marxists. The rise of the alt-right has given new life to the cultural Marxist conspiracy theory. And even Richard Spencer, the US's most prominent white supremacist who co-edits altright.com and Radix, promulgates a whole range of conspiracy stories about cultural Marxism in America. The alt-right's clown prince, Milo Yiannopoulos, even spoke of cultural Marxism in articles with headlines such as, "I've been censored and it's getting dark. How cultural Marxism locked me out of my car." In 2018, the right-wing libertarian Ron Paul retweeted, then deleted a racist cartoon about cultural Marxism. And we now see this conspiracy theory spread across social media platforms. On Facebook, a Stop Cultural Marxism page describes cultural Marxists as people who are cancer in human form. In late 2018, the video sharing site YouTube streamed almost 174,000 videos about cultural Marxism with titles such as Nazi Rubber Duck Explains Cultural Marxism and Cultural Marxism, the Ideological Disease Destroying America and Western Civilization. Amazon.com, meanwhile, retails books about the so-called corrupting influence of cultural Marxism, and here are a few titles. But what does the alt-right really mean when it uses the phrase cultural Marxism? Well, the alt-right represents cultural Marxism as responsible for or equivalent to every idea, value, person, group, organization, product, or practice that purportedly offends, challenges, or afflicts the identities and beliefs of white conservative Christian Americans, and most of the time, those being white conservative Christian cisgendered men. Indeed, cultural Marxism is said to be the cause and the effect of social justice, of feminism, gender equality, and women's right to get an abortion or a divorce, of the very existence of LGBTQ people, of racial equality and multiculturalism, of affirmative action policy in the workplace, even at Starbucks. Cultural Marxism is furthermore said to be the cause and effect of big government, social welfare programs, gun control policies, the United Nations, the ACLU and MoveOn.org, social movements such as Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and Me Too, Colin Kaepernick and the NFL players that took the knee in support of Black Lives Matter. Hollywood is supposedly in on it too. Star Wars The Force Awakens is said to be cultural Marxist because of its multi-gendered and multicultural cast. For the alt-right, the universities and colleges of America are also bastions of cultural Marxism. Evidently, the alt-right's discourse about cultural Marxism is a totalizing or global conspiracy theory, as it attempts to identify or explain the singular cause or motor force behind innumerable phenomena. Of course, there is no empirical ground beneath the idea that Marxists rule the big institutions of American society. Read any history of Marxism and socialism in the United States. No Marxist or socialist party has ever achieved hegemony over the federal government, over the education system, or over the media and cultural industries. The nation's dominant common sense has been in the main quite unfriendly to Marxism and socialism, and Marxism has long been America's unofficial anti-ideology. The US federal government? No cultural Marxist there. At present, the billionaire Trump presides over the most powerful government in the world, and Trump's cabinet is full of oligarchic millionaires, while the Republican-controlled Congress and Senate are more supportive of other billionaires and millionaires and transnational corporations than they are of the working class, let alone the democratic socialists of America. Sure, some universities and colleges in the United States do hire Marxist professors, and why wouldn't they? Marx is one of the most important thinkers of all time. Yet far from being overrun by red-tenured radicals, most universities, the Marxists within these universities at least, have marginal influence and power as compared to, say, neoliberal mind managers or business school economists. And what about the alt-right's idea that cultural Marxists preside over the nation's media and cultural industries? Well, that's absolute rubbish. Billionaires such as News Corp's Rupert Murdoch, not Marxist or socialist, own the US-based globalizing ICT and media industries, and Marxists have never seized the means of mental production or forged gigantic for-profit media companies capable of manufacturing mass consent to a working-class revolution against the capitalist status quo. Cultural Marxism is the ultimate post-factual dog whistle for the extreme right. The alt-right's conspiracy theory can be easily debunked, and anyone who believes it is living inside the matrix. Despite its falsity, this conspiracy theory spreads around the world, shaping what people think about cultural Marxism and people it labels cultural Marxists. How then does the alt-right use this conspiracy as a rhetorical tool or propaganda weapon for organizing consent to its hate? First, the alt-right uses the conspiracy theory as a culture war strategy for constructing an American self in its own hateful image. The alt-right constructs America as essentially white, Anglo-Saxon, and European. For the alt-right, America's gender-sex regime is patriarchal, heteronormative, and centered around the nuclear family. Its religious order is Christian, its economic structure is capitalist, and the values of individualism, meritocracy, and private property are sacrosanct. For the alt-right, this is the essential America. Having constructed an idealized notion of itself, the alt-right then uses the discourse of cultural Marxism to construct an anti or un-American other, a foil for its white supremacist ideal of its nation, of its people. The alt-right labels nonconformers to its white patriarchal Christian capitalist alt-American ideal as cultural Marxists. And this is a very broad label, including everyone from liberals to white social justice activists to non-white people to feminists to LGBTQ people to immigrants to atheists to Muslims to Jews to socialists and on and on. All of these are bundled together by the alt-right as cultural Marxists. The alt-right even represents elites who are not Marxists as Marxists. So everyone from Hillary Clinton to Justin Trudeau to George Soros to Pope Francis to Oprah Winfrey to Rachel Maddow can all be reduced to cultural Marxists too. The alt-right furthermore uses this discourse of cultural Marxism to construct the people it depicts as others to the America as not only un-American, but also as enemy threats to America. Ron Paul, for example, says that cultural Marxism is, quote, a form of cultural terrorism against America. By depicting those people it labels as cultural Marxists as enemy threats to alt-America, the alt-right shows fear, suspicion, and paranoia about its opponents. It ignites hatred for a wide range of people that are not anti-American, and most often not even close to being Marxists. Furthermore, the alt-right agitates for violence against the people it constructs as cultural Marxists, constructing these Marxists as enemy threats to America, and representing violence as a way to defend and secure America from this threat. Now, given how flexible the alt-right's epithetical label of cultural Marxism is, anyone who does not fit into alt-America is vulnerable to being smeared as a cultural Marxist, and everyone that the alt-right demonizes as a cultural Marxist can become a potential target of a violent hate campaign to smash cultural Marxism. Now, recall how on July 22nd, 2011, the fascist terrorist Anders Behring Breivik, prior to murdering 77 civilians, many of which were children, called upon white people all over the world to take up arms against the cultural Marxists. Also, the alt-right uses this discourse on cultural Marxism as a tool of populism. This alt-right discourse reduces alt-American people as victims of cultural Marxism, people who are being oppressed in some way by this cultural Marxist elite and its political correctness and social justice ideology. By constructing cultural Marxists as bad un-American elites and alt-Americans as a virtuous yet victimized people, the alt-right casts itself as a populist vanguard of a people's movement to take on the elite. Additionally, the alt-right uses the discourse on cultural Marxism to deny the historical and contemporary reality of sexism, racism, and classism in the United States. It makes the struggle for social justice appear to be a top-down conspiracy, as opposed to what it really is, a bottom-up community response to the real existing problems of the world. Significantly, the alt-right uses the discourse of cultural Marxism to obscure the essence of the actual elite groups in positions of structural and institutional decision-making power in the United States. Take the economy and take the state. While actual Marxists point to the owners of the big corporations as society's ruling class, for the alt-right, it seems that being an elite means holding liberal ideas as opposed to holding concentrations of capital and therefore political power. And this is total nonsense. As Slavoj Žižek recently said, well, what people call cultural Marxism is one of the last liberal bourgeois defenses against Marxism. It is falsely radical. The alt-right's discourse distracts people from the corporate elites that exercise real power in the United States and enables these elites to proceed with business as usual, securing their profits and their power with help from two mostly compliant parties. This is very much a blue pill of and for the alt-right, which keeps its acolytes and followers inside an ideological matrix of sorts. Unfortunately, this alt-right blue pill is going global and being taken up by right-wingers around the world and other countries like Canada. Here, Jordan Peterson has been associated with the alt-right's cultural Marxist conspiracy theory. But does Peterson actually believe it? Does he perpetuate it? To the best of my knowledge, Peterson has only directly used the phrase cultural Marxism once, and this was in a video answer to a question posed by an Australian fan about same-sex marriage. The Jordan Peterson fans said that they were against the legalization of same-sex marriage in Australia because it was supposedly backed by cultural Marxists. And then they asked Jordan Peterson to explain his own views on same-sex marriage. Peterson's response was confusing, disappointing, but telling. Here's what he said, quote, "Well, I would be against gay marriage if it were backed by cultural Marxists. But if the marital vows were taken seriously, then it seems to me that gay marriage is a means whereby gay people could be integrated more thoroughly into standard society." Peterson continued, The problem of gay marriage is that it seems to me to be part of a wedge, and it isn't obvious to me that legalizing gay marriage has done anything to decrease the demands that the radical left and neo-Marxist types are placing on traditional society. Like a growing faction of the political right, Peterson's fan implies that same-sex marriage is the outcome of a plot by a cultural Marxist cabal to disrupt and destroy the foundations of traditional society. And Peterson lets this ludicrous mode of explaining the rights won by LGBTQ people for equal treatment under the law go unchallenged. That said, Peterson only directly uses the phrase cultural Marxism once, preferring instead to use terms such as postmodern Marxism. Nonetheless, in alt-right discourse and in the discourse of Peterson's fans, the terms cultural Marxism, postmodernism, and neo-Marxism are often synonymous. In this regard, it is no surprise that many young and impressionable Peterson followers don't always distinguish between the alt-right's conspiracy of cultural Marxism and Peterson's talk of postmodern neo-Marxism. There's so much confusion online. Check out the Reddit website. You'll find a full subreddit on the subreddit for Jordan Peterson. There, Peterson fans and critics alike debate his usages and meanings of cultural Marxism. Regardless of Peterson's intent, many of his alt-right followers seem to assume that their guru is giving credence to the cultural Marxist conspiracy. Just take a look around. Jordan Peterson fans all over the world are producing, circulating, consuming YouTube videos promoting Peterson with titles like Postmodernism and Cultural Marxism, Jordan B. Peterson. Marxism and Cultural Marxist Tenets, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, Political Correctness, Postmodernism and Cultural Marxism Alliance, Explained. Jordan Peterson, Postmodernism and Cultural Marxism, Within Universities. Peterson Facebook fans friend videos with titles like Smashing Cultural Marxism, Jordan Peterson is driving his critics to desperate acts. Even Andrew Anglin, one of the most infamous neo-Nazis today, is getting in on the fun, creating remixes of Peterson videos that prop Peterson up as some kind of neo-Nazi stormtrooper. On Twitter, we find lots of Peterson fans tweeting about the threat of cultural Marxism. And even though Peterson says his retweets are not to be read unfailingly as endorsements, he has retweeted stories from alt-right sites such as Cultural Marxism is Destroying America. And Peterson has retweeted videos he appears in, like Postmodernism and Cultural Marxism. Given the above, it's not surprising that in the international mainstream media, magazines like the New Zealand Listener represent Peterson as, quote, an internet sensation for his outspoken criticism of what he calls political correctness and cultural Marxism. All the while, Christian think tanks like the Interface Institute publish stories that depict Western religious policies being profoundly shaped by postmodernism and cultural Marxism, and then link their readers to a video talk by Peterson. I do not claim that Jordan Peterson created the alt-right conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism, nor do I claim that Jordan Peterson necessarily believes this conspiracy theory to be true. But what is evident is that Jordan Peterson, by ignorance or by choice, has amplified this conspiracy theory, and the alt-right's acolytes are lapping it up. Even outside the alt-right, Peterson's discourse may act as a gateway to the alt-right, and this needs to be challenged. When Jordan Peterson complains about middling bureaucrats and postmodern professionals with their neo-Marxist and postmodern Marxist ideology, imposing upon him ideas of social justice and political correctness and equity policy in the workplace, he casts himself as a victim. Yet far from being a victim, Jordan Peterson epitomizes an elite. In fact, he's part of the 1%er club, but he uses his power, his wealth, and his prestige not to fight for the working class, but rather to defend traditional ideas and the status quo. And the status quo is typified by radical and growing social and economic inequality. Global productivity is increasing, gross domestic product continues to rise, and corporate profits soar, but inequality between the rich and the poor is widening. At present, the wealthiest 85 people on the planet have more money than the poorest 3.5 billion combined. The richest 1% of the Earth's population owns more than half of the Earth's total wealth. The richest 0.1% of households in the United States command as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. In 1978, CEO earnings were roughly 30 times the average worker's salary. In 2017, the average CEO to worker pay ratio was a whopping 339 to 1. These unequal social conditions are the outcome of a combination of capitalist logics and political choices made by governments, and they underpin so much of the collective and individual experienced by millions of people in society today. But instead of enlightening his millions of followers about the real economic and political determinations of social inequality, Peterson keeps them in the dark. Indeed, Peterson naturalizes inequality as an expression of hierarchies of competence that benefit everyone, He justifies inequality with recourse to some bogus notion of meritocracy. As he says, smart people who work hard are the ones who get ahead. And at worst, and apropos his rants against neo-Marxism and postmodern Marxism and cultural Marxism, Peterson smears those people and movements who are concerned about and are trying to solve the problem of social inequality by equating these people with a totalitarian ideology. In sum, by deflecting his followers' attention away from the source of inequality, that being capitalism and neoliberal policy choices, explaining inequality as an expression of natural as opposed to social relations, and framing left thinkers and movements being enthralled to an evil totalitarian ideology, Peterson has distinguished himself as a ruling class intellectual. Arguably, Peterson's meritocratic message is harming those he wishes to help. As Nathan Robinson recently says, Peterson speaks to disaffected, and I would add, working class millennial men. Yet he's offering them terrible advice, because the individual responsibility ethic makes one feel like a failure for failing. Yet millennials struggle in part because of a viciously competitive economy that is crushing them with debt and a lack of opportunity. But if you can't pay your student loans or your rent and you can't get a better job, what use is it to tell you that you should adopt a confident lobster posture? That said, I do not believe Dr. Peterson is a fascist, even though he's been associated with fascism on a few occasions. Now, Dr. Peterson, this is a message for you. Given you profess to be on the side of enlightenment, I urge you to use your intellect to inform your fans about how harmful the neo-fascist movement's blue pill of cultural Marxism is to rational discourse, to informed citizenry, and to a good society. Dr. Peterson, I challenge you to use your pulpit to warn your followers of the real threat the fascist right's blue pill poses to substantive human freedom and democracy. And as one public educator to another, Dr. Peterson, please, please help your students get off the alt-right's blue pill. At present, the alt-right's blue pill of cultural Marxism is in mass supply, widely circulated, and very addictive. The blue pill pulls more and more users into a matrix of ignorance, but fortunately, it is being countered by another pill that enhances the human faculty to understand the source of the bad conditions of the world and galvanizes people to forge movements and build organizations that struggle to change the world and for the better. This is the red pill called democratic socialism, and it, not the alt-right's placebo red pill, has the power to free our mind from the rating system's algorithm. This red pill shows us the ugly truth of capitalism and liberates us from the matrix of alt-right propagandists who try to sedate us with hate and distract us from class rule. After this, there is no turning back. You take the alt-right's blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and the democratic socialist left shows you how deep the rabbit hole goes. That said, I think it is important to try to learn something from Jordan Peterson's popular resonance. Jordan Peterson has a much larger following than any left public intellectual today, in print, on Patreon, and across lecture halls. It is too simplistic to explain Jordan Peterson's popularity with regard to the rise of the alt-right and its wacky cultural Marxist conspiracy theory alone. Other questions should be asked. What are the benefits of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and his self-help videos to the working people that consume this content? What can the socialist left learn from or possibly even do with the form of a self-help book? And how to address individuals with regard to their personal problems, but then effectively explain those problems with regard to the wider social conditions that shape them? This is one of the many challenges the democratic socialist left faces today. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks also to the organizers for organizing this conference. The New Symbolization Project, Boise DSA, and Zero Books, your work is very much appreciated. Keep up the good fight. Thank you.
Are we on camera? I can't see yet. I think we're on camera.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Tanner. So I think we have about 15 minutes to wrap this thing up. It'd be great to get some questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, etc., from other people.
Great content. You mentioned you showed some of the books in there, The Culture of Critique, which I found was really
oh crap.
excuse me. Yeah, go ahead. But like, this overarching idea that there's like this slot of
Hey, Al.
like intellectual.
Hey, Al.
I think I'm losing.
You know, like.
Al, we're gonna go to someone else for a second.
But is there anything that seriously, yeah?
Yeah, we're gonna go to someone else for a second because you've got a serious leg happening right now. So if you could get somewhere where you think you have better service, then you can come back with this question. But it was way too choppy. So someone else.
I could definitely ask a question. I thought that was a fantastic presentation, a really interesting argument, and there were various points that I thought resonated with some of the things that I've been thinking about as well in relation to postmodern neo-Marxism and kind of all these various Marxisms that Peterson seemed to think are ranged against him. One thing that kind of occurred to me as you were talking about the empirical evidence or lack thereof for the influence of cultural Marxism in society, you know, there are no Marxists in government. There are no Marxists in control of kind of industries and so on. I guess one area that the alt-right like to, including Peterson, like to point to for empirical evidence of this kind of dominance, I imagine, is academia, because you definitely do have Marxists in academia. Not the majority of academics, but probably the majority of academics are left-wing. Certainly in the UK they are, and I imagine it's not much different in the US. So that was just an observation. The other question that I had was a bit, I guess, a different version of the same question I got earlier, which was I was asked if, you know, how if we were to kind of move away from free speech, could we use Lacan, move some other radical form of democracy? You know, how can we and how would that be put into practice? And I guess so a kind of practical question. I've not seen The Matrix for a long time, but one of the characters, I can't remember his name, the character, the traitor, I can't remember what his name is in the first film, but the one who kind of sells them out. He doesn't want to take the red pill, right? He basically he wants to live in the Matrix because life in the Matrix is simpler and more pleasurable. So how do we get people to take the red pill of democratic socialism, given the blue pill that they may already be being sold is one that kind of provides a form of order that they're quite happy with or satisfied with? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, those are excellent questions. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. I think the first point regarding sort of the role or the influence of Marxists or left-wingers in academia has been, you know, widely overstated, especially by the conservative movement going back to the mid-70s. One of the first kind of wedges in the culture war strategy was to sort of start trying to weed out, you know, I wouldn't say radical socialist Marxist academics, but liberalism became a problem for the right-wing movement in the United States. And so, of course, there are, you know, Marxist sort of minded professors in some social science and humanities departments, faculties, programs. But I don't think that they, you know, by any stretch of the imagination represent a majority. And they certainly don't, reflect a majority across all of the faculties of universities. So if we were going to just do one of those sort of counting exercises where we could say, okay, how many actual existing Marxists are employed by X university? And let's, you know, perhaps choose Jordan Peterson's University of Toronto. You'd probably find, you know, in the range of like 5 to 8%. If you look at Jordan Peterson's psychology department, there are no Marxists there. If you look at the Rotman School of Management, which is basically training middle managers for capital, there's no Marxists there. You know, at best, you'll have someone that might give you a bit of Keynes, a bit of Adam Smith, maybe some Friedrich von Hayek, even if they go into the philosophical foundations of modern capitalism, which often is not the case because so much of the training revolves around just skilling people for work. So I just think that's something that we really, really need to push back on. I think it's like an alt-right or a paleo-conservative or maybe even mainstream conservative talking point that has become like common sense. And they've been very effective in generalizing this point of view. That's my experience of the Canadian education system. Perhaps it's different in the United States or in the UK, but I just think it would be really interesting to try to debunk this. Now, no, granted, certainly liberal-minded people are certainly in abundance within higher education. But I think that's a very, very important distinction to make between, say, liberals and then like socialists or Marxist political economists, because I think they have different philosophical and political orientations. But what the right's done is it's conflated these two things. And I think you need to disarticulate those two positions to have a more accurate picture of higher education today, especially in the United States context, where we know higher education, there's a lot of literature on academic capitalism, on the role of finance in universities. So to say this is sort of overrun by red tenured radicals, just I think is delusional. But the right still seems to propagate this idea. The second point with regard to the red pill, blue pill thing, and yes, indeed, people in sort of Plato's cave perhaps preferred the shadow puppets dancing upon the wall, and there are certain pleasures of living in ideology as opposed to confronting those sort of harsher realities of capital today. But I think that the work that the alt-right is asking its followers to do is equally challenging. I think that actually to become a white nationalist, you are actually pushing back against somewhat of an entrenched neoliberal cosmopolitan pluralist framework that is also going to get you into some hot water. So if the alt-right is able to resuscitate neo-fascism and neo-Nazism after about 3 decades of a kind of like neoliberal cosmopolitan global consensus, I think that the left would sort of be incumbent upon the left to work harder to sort of present that sort of red pill of democratic socialism in a digestible, perhaps attractive form. And to do that, I think engaging in thinking through our communications, thinking through our rhetorical strategies, thinking about the difference between the kinds of discussions and debates we have as academics, which often operates on a very high theoretical plane, which is tremendously valuable, but it's sort of how do we translate the sort of propositions that we make as theorists and then say, well, what do we do in the day-to-day work of political communications, of political rhetoric, of making arguments and winning them, of conveying our point of view in a way that would be as resonant as Jordan Peterson's, video lectures, So that's kind of what I think I'm more interested at on the ground. Is how do we connect those two different spheres of what we do in academia and then what we do as day-to-day activists or political subjects or citizens of one kind or another. Well, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant.
Al, do you think you might want to take another stab at it?
Yes. Can you hear me now? Is that working out all right?
So far, so good.
Okay, so far so good. All right. So you mentioned a book that I recently became familiar with that strikes me in just like its quantum absurdity, but the culture of critique, right? You had that up in the video, and this you mentioned how sort of this cultural Marxist conspiracy theory is just a rebranding of the old Nazi Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, and this underlying linchpin that it's this dissemination of sort of like this Jewish cabal that has entered into all ranking, forms of society and forms of whatever, is an overarching theme, specifically within fascist works. And I'm just like, I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more on that sort of link between like the old school, Italian and German fascist conspiracy theories and how they relate to the current neo-Nazi ones. I guess that's my question a bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent historical question, and it requires, I think, a much more intensive and in-depth comparative approach. Comparative fascisms. How was sort of German sort of Nazi fascism sort of similar to and different from Italian fascism under Mussolini in the context that Gramsci was writing, and how do those older sort of modes of fascism then compare and contrast to what we see happening over the past 10 years or so in the United States? And then how do you compare, say, the alt-right to, say, the Ku Klux Klan and the sort of explicit, Nazi, say, National Socialist, organization in the United States and so on? I think that what's kind of different about the alt-right today, though I'm seeing this sort of changing, is that much of it sort of functioned early on as a kind of dog whistle, where you wouldn't just come out and basically say, there's some sort of Jewish ruling class that's responsible for all the ills and problems of the world, and then calling for sort of some sort of genocidal movement to eliminate Jewish peoples from the United States. It was so much more sort of coded and sort of gestural. So the kind of cultural Marxist conspiracy theory, does say that the evil seed of cultural Marxism was planted by Jewish Marxists fleeing Nazi Germany. And the assumption there is that if Horkheimer and Adorno didn't sort of, flee Nazi Germany and sort of set up school in the United States, none of these kind of sort of tendencies would have emerged in the 60s, and the situation wouldn't sort of be so bad for, white cisgender Christian, men and women in some respects. So I think there's a lot of important work to do there in trying to make those fine distinctions. And I think there's an opening for both academics and activists to try to sort this. But over the past, I've been noticing like much more explicitly anti-Semitic statements, much more explicitly anti-Semitic imagery. So it seems to be sort of, getting beyond sort of the dog whistle style of politics in some way. But I mean, I need to look at this in more detail. There's just some peripheral thoughts. What do you think about those distinctions?
Just between different forms of fascism on that, or just between what we're seeing now? Well, specifically, Andrew Anglin seems to be like, I think it's important to make that distinction between sort of like the alt-right figures and the alt-right figures.
Yes.
Right? And even so, between basically what I've seen is that there's very much two distinct flavors of the alt-right in terms of like people, especially since Charlottesville, that has been, the point zero for the alt-right. Between people who kind of see Richard Spencer as the leader of the movement and people who look at alternative paths and people to follow and so on and so forth. But specifically about like someone like Andrew Anglin completely blowing through with that dog whistle is much different than, Milo Yiannopoulos or with these sort of things, right? And there's so much, we like to talk about our infighting on the left a lot, but the infighting on the alt-right seem levels of vitriol that I don't even see in some of the darkest places on the internet. So, I think those are clear distinctions that need to be made, but I think the figure of Anglin really holds precedent in terms of being sort of like the foremost, like, shock doctor with a wide enough audience who's calling out, some of the more explicit calls of, racism, anti-Semitism, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it's interesting, when I was doing some of the research on Jordan Peterson's usage of, neo-Marxism, postmodern Marxism, cultural Marxism, I was noticing that there's some, hard alt-right figures that are sort of denouncing Peterson, because over the past 6 or 7 months, he's kind of said, he's condemned anti-Semites, he's condemned some of the racial sort of white identitarians. In a similar way, he's actually condemned any kind of cultural essentialism as a basis for identity politics, right or left. So it seems to be, I've noticed like alt-right sort of, Reddit sort of forums and such saying like, Peterson's really not our man. Well, he seems to be more aligned with the alt-right figures, but there's definitely these crossovers.
No, there's a synergy in there between those movements. But yeah, I agree with you. There. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Was there any points? I'm just curious. Should I post this video like on YouTube or something? Share it with others, or what? Are there points you think that are, not sufficiently elaborated, or you can imagine counterpoints to? I'm just interested in the reception.
So I would say absolutely that it should go on YouTube. It should be made publicly accessible, and that we would happily share it off of our page and into the actual Facebook event page for this conference, because it's pretty important background. For instance, like I've heard, I've spent a lot of time trying to keep up with the discourse surrounding or revolving around the intellectual dark web, the anti-PC industry, and Jordan Peterson specifically. And in keeping up with all of that, you do hear people say that it was kind of a dog whistle, that he was saying cultural Marxism, and that he switched from saying that to saying neo-Marxism, which is I think probably because people said something about it, and maybe he was ignorant of that, or maybe he just realized that his that it was sort of shining a light on his secret consumption of John Birch Society literature, or right? That's speculation on my part, but yeah, I didn't know a whole lot about the cultural Marxism thing until, like, I guess I've seen just a couple of videos by people that are like Breitbart or the alt-right or whatever, that are like, it's like conspiracy music in the background, and they're showing like cherry-picked quotes from Adorno and stuff like that. So I think that it's important just for combating the misinformation. I think one thing that's really that Peterson has gotten past, just in terms of rhetoric, and I'll turn this into a question actually, but in terms of the rhetorical approach and for disseminating information in general on Peterson's part, something that he seems to have gotten over is how he will be perceived for saying this or that. And as someone who's been organizing stuff like this, never quite on this scale, but stuff like this for the last couple of years, I've experienced a lot of leftist to left-leaning academics who are really, really fucking like concerned with being taken out of context. And it's just like, this is the postmodern condition. You cannot expect people to read you, and you will be taken out of context. And if we really want to get the word out, then we have to expect that we'll be made memes of. But that at the end of the day, like, we've got like this fire hose of ignorance on the one side, and then like this desert of the response. Like, we have not. There really isn't a real response or presence on the left, coming from the left on YouTube. I mean, it's emerging.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be great if you would join the ranks of that. And so I would just add to all of this a question. So what are some of the insights? I guess you did kind of touch on this, but yeah, insights into rhetorical approach on his part that you think the left can adopt or appropriate from Peterson and other folks over there. And then I also want to kind of turn that over to everyone else in this chat. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, first of all, I just want to say, like, kudos to you and the other organizers. Again, I can't emphasize how exciting what you're doing is, and how needed it is, and how important it is. And it's remarkable that you're pulling such an event to this scale off. And so this is definitely a step in the right direction. Because I think up until this point, with regard to Peterson, many liberals and leftists, they've had their op-ed pieces and such, but there hasn't been really a sustained or systematic sort of, response, or by serious intellectuals. And often what you see is kind of Peterson arguing with undergrad students, or maybe a journalist that hasn't sort of done the background reading. So what you've accomplished is tremendous, and I'm just really excited about it. In terms of the rhetorical strategies, I mean, I think Peterson speaks like an everyday kind of colloquialisms, and I think that really does resonate with a lot of people. If some of the people that are identifying with Peterson are doing so because I think they don't see Peterson as kind of like an elite kind of snob who's going to speak over them or tell them sort of exactly how to think or how to perceive the world, or introduce them to very, very complex sort of concepts, or, French post-structuralists. And again, it's like, all of that stuff that we do as academics is tremendously valuable and important. But I think there's a world of difference between what Peterson does as a clinical psychologist and what he's doing now as kind of like a political rhetorician for the alt-right or the conservative movement. And I think we'd have to sort of study exactly what is the appeal, how does he address his audience, how does he respond to questions. He certainly doesn't respond to questions by his opponents in a very friendly fashion. Whereas perhaps liberals or lefties would, again, respect the rules of the sort of Habermasian public sphere and try to sort of be as civic or civil as possible. I don't think Peterson really gives a damn. I think Peterson literally speaks his mind. And for that reason, he's criticized widely because he doesn't make a lot of sense and he's taking quotes out of context and he doesn't really have that coherent of, I think, a philosophical backbone at times. But I think he really is speaking from the heart. And I think that registers with people. So I haven't really come across as many left public intellectuals that really speak from the heart in that way, in that affective dimension. So I'm not sure. Does that make any sense? Or am I way off base?
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think that, your appeal to his Enlightenment values was a wise move. That same thing could be said for Pinker. I think that we should always challenge these people on the values they espouse, and that the left could probably benefit, just anybody, any of us coming from the left could benefit from not being like, oh, we're anti-Enlightenment or whatever, oh, because of colonialism and all that, but to be like, no, like, integral to the Enlightenment project is self-criticism and the criticism of institutions of power and exploitation. That is the Enlightenment project just as much as reason and logic and, whatever else, liberal democracy.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the space for immanent critique that, say Marx would have been responsible for. I mean, Marx is basically saying all of these ideas of human freedom and equality and democracy are great, but look at colonial slavery, look at wage slavery, look at exploitation, look at the oppression of women, look at the oppression of the colonies, look at what the British Empire is doing to India, and so it's basically sort of saying, what are your stated values and why are they not being substantively realized in practice? And then how would you sort of parse that gap between what your principles are and then what's actually happening on the ground? And I think that's what immanent critique is best at doing. And so I think it's not useful simply just to sort of do the deconstructionist move. It's one thing to say that this was part of some kind of, global imperial project, but it's quite another to say that some of the substantive ideas were useless, because that would do a disservice to the long history of even, say, anti-colonial national liberation movements, which were taking up ideas that were established during that period and then trying to realize them in their concrete struggle. So even what you see, for example, India was the first post-colonial nation state, and it was like a long sort of, protracted violent and non-violent liberation struggle against the British Empire, for the sort of stated principles that it could not realize in practice. Like, we want to be sovereign, we want to be free, right? So there's challenges there, for sure. And so I think you can sort of take conservative sort of intellectuals to task by saying, like, okay, this all sounds nice in theory, but, give me your concrete evidence of how this is playing out in the real world. Oh, you talk about equality? Well, why is there so much inequality? You talk about democracy? That's an abstraction. You show me an example of substantive participatory democracy. So these concepts themselves are a train of struggle that the left and the right fight over. And I think the left has to do a better job of articulating these ideas to its own project, as opposed just to ceding that terrain to its opponent.
It looked like Al had something. Yeah.
Yeah, I dig it, but I just want to correct you on one thing. Haiti was the first post-colonial nation.
Oh, yes.
Sure. Right? About
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
The Black Jacobins.
Yep.
The one successful slave revolt. Yeah. So we have time for two more. The janitor just opened the door and was like,
something serious is happening in here.
Yeah, well, it's because like we're in dark, you know, but the lighting was cool, so we kept it this way. But the lights turn off automatically every once in a while. So yeah, cool. Well, I guess without any unless someone has something, unless they're going to interject themselves, I will just say that all of the conference details are officially up on new-symbolization.org. The information and abstracts for almost all of the speakers is up, thanks to Anne here. And that if yours is not up yet, to get that information to Anne, because she's going to get that all there. And then so even our absentee presenters, such as yourselves, are going to be featured there, and this video will be there underneath stuff. And so
yeah, I was gonna say, when I publish the video to YouTube at one point, I can put it on your page.
That would be awesome. Yeah, if you could, yes, just circulate it through the site. I'd really appreciate it, because I'd be interested in getting it out there and seeing what others think about it as well.
Yeah, I can totally do that.
Also, I think that the left is, in terms of Peterson and the anti-PC industry, they are very much no qualms at all about branding and marketing and I mean even leadership. These things that can be so divisive and contentious in various leftist circles, and it's just like, okay, well, I think that when this conference is right as this conference is coming up, and through the conference and then after the conference, we should be blasting this everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, social media of all types, email lists, etc. And if you check out the NSP Facebook page, that's where all the events are currently listed as they are developing. We have one more pregame session next week. It will be yeah, a couple more people presenting beforehand, and that we really hope to get a lot of visibility during the conference. Peterson has already responded to the fact that it's happening. He never responded to our invitations. Like he didn't say anything on his Twitter about our invitations. But when Brett Cooper, who's presenting next week, when Brett Cooper, who's presenting next week, sent him an email, that's when he responded. And it was like flagrant disregard kind of a thing, acting as though that was the first he had heard of it. We hope and expect that this will get more of a response from his fan base, and be particularly compelling to those of his fan base who have intellectual integrity and curiosity, and who have been drawn by Peterson's better ideas, and just don't know much about some of the more problematic aspects. So
amazing.
Yeah.
So great.
I just want to add one thing onto what you were saying, Dave. I think one of the biggest things that the right has really focused on, and has for a long time, in sort of the new media landscape, as this as having the ability to sort of shape and structure their message and their conference, like, you know, the sort of like with Ben Shapiro with his Daily Wire thing, right? And it will show, you know, like, oh, he's getting questions from leftists, you know, at this talk, but it's, you know, cut and edited into such a way, whatever, to make it look, you know, like that epic, you know, okay, epic thing, right?
Yeah, like Ben Shapiro destroys leftist.
Epic takedown.
Yeah.
So we just have to do that.
So like, I think well, no, I'm not to do that, but we have to be able to sort of shape the narrative a little bit and get the distribution out, right? Because I know this from my own experience being involved with like actions and stuff like that, right? That especially when you're just relying sort of on you know, mainstream news coverage or whatever, whether it be you know, like your local paper, like in Atlanta, we have Creative Loafing or Student Run Papers or, you know, Vice or AP or whatever that is. You can't just rely on them to, you know, accurately report, you know, everything out of it. There's a high, you know, probability, especially when you're dealing with contentious issues, that it's going to be taken out of context and with this postmodern, you know, whatever the fuck. So building these sort of media organizational structures, so on and so forth, I think is of utmost importance and incredibly pertinent to where the future of left is going.
Agree, 100%.
Awesome. Well, everybody, this has been a fantastic evening. We really appreciate y'all for joining, especially Ben. I'm sure it's probably like 4 in the morning or where you're at right now. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for organizing it. And this has, been fantastically interesting. Worth staying up for.
Cool. All right. Well, have a great rest of your night, everybody.
Okay. Thanks so much. Take good care. Bye-bye.